What if I told you that everything you believed about the beautiful Victorian era is a lie? Behind the glittering facades and lavish balls lay a completely different, terrifying reality on the streets of London, one that you certainly won't learn about in a typical history class. You'll be surprised at how close these two worlds were. In the same city, people existed in parallel universes that almost never intersected. The immense wealth of some was built on the endless, grueling labor of others who remained in the deepest shadows. We've gathered shocking details of daily life that will make you look at this era in a completely new light. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how ordinary coal smoke created an insurmountable barrier between luxury and poverty in the capital of a great empire. Are you ready to learn the truth about how invisible walls divided millions of people? Victorian London was a vast machine where every detail had a strictly designated place. The city had no physical fences between the rich and poor neighborhoods. However, the social boundary was stronger than any stone or brick. Crossing this invisible line was practically impossible under any circumstances. The aristocracy viewed their position as a natural and unshakable order of things. They were born into luxury and, from their earliest days, absorbed the rules of their exclusive circle. To them, the poor neighborhoods seemed like some kind of unexplored wilderness on another continent. Many wealthy Londoners never once set foot in the capital's eastern districts in their entire lives. They moved through the city in closed carriages, observing the world through thick glass. To ordinary workers, the city looked completely different. Their horizon was limited to factory chimneys and the narrow alleys around their workplace. Every day they walked past luxurious mansions, realizing the absolute unattainability of that world. The social ladder had no rungs for those born at the very bottom. The education and employment system was designed to keep the existing order unchanged. The wind carried factory smoke directly toward the cheap housing, making the air there thick and heavy. In this way, nature itself became an instrument of social division in the capital. Interaction between the classes was limited to strictly regulated functions. The elite hired servants, who became the only bridge between the two worlds. But even the servants were required to remain invisible and silent in the presence of their masters. Separate narrow staircases and hidden passageways were built for them inside the large mansions. This allowed the masters to enjoy their comfort without noticing the presence of others. A person's appearance instantly revealed their caste. Clothing served as a passport that opened or closed doors to certain establishments. The fabrics, cut, and cleanliness of one's attire spoke more about a person than their words. A worker in a worn jacket could not physically walk down the main street without drawing suspicious glances. The police strictly ensured that the poor did not linger in affluent neighborhoods. Charity from the elite was often merely a formality. Wealthy families donated funds for the construction of workers' housing or hospitals for the poor. However, they did so more to maintain their own status and ease their consciences. The real causes of poverty were never discussed in respectable drawing rooms. It was considered bad form to speak of hard labor or a lack of basic resources. Poverty was perceived by society as the result of a person's personal shortcomings. Wealthy gentlemen sincerely believed that poverty stemmed from laziness and a lack of determination. They failed to account for the initial lack of equal opportunities to get started. In this framework, wealth signified not only financial success, but also moral superiority. The poor were constantly made to feel guilty about their social status. Moving from one class to another was a rare exception to the rule. Even a merchant who had suddenly struck it rich could not simply buy his way into high society. Old aristocratic families jealously guarded their privileges against newcomers. Lineage was valued far more highly than the size of one's bank account or business acumen. For centuries, society had preserved itself within rigid, established boundaries. This contrast created incredible tension within a single urban space. Two different groups of people lived on the same streets, spoke different dialects, and did not understand one another. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such a rigid social divide that was impossible to overcome? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new in-depth explorations. Guess what happened next with the development of urban architecture? Population growth led to a catastrophic shortage of living space in the central districts. Wealthy families began building huge mansions in the western part of the capital, far from the hustle and bustle. These houses resembled real palaces with dozens of spacious and bright rooms. Silence, tranquility, and strict order always reigned there, maintained by an army of servants. The poor population huddled in the so-called slums in the eastern part of the city. People didn't rent apartments, but rather corners in dark and damp rooms. 10 or 15 people could live in a single small room at the same time. They had to take turns sleeping, as there simply wasn't enough floor space for everyone. These buildings were often constructed from cheap materials and were literally falling apart before our eyes. In the mansions of the elite, every room had a specific purpose. There were separate rooms for morning receptions, evening meals, and playing billiards. Libraries were filled with rare books, and the walls were adorned with original, famous paintings. The space was organized so that family members could go entire days without crossing paths. Huge windows let in plenty of natural light, which was an incredible luxury. The homes of the poor had absolutely no decorations or unnecessary items. The only furniture to be found there was a rickety table and a couple of wooden benches. Instead of beds, they used sacks stuffed tightly with straw or old rags. The walls were covered with a layer of soot from cheap coal stoves that constantly smoked. The humidity was so high that water often dripped from the ceiling. Wealthy townspeople spent enormous sums to keep their residences in perfect condition. They regularly hired craftsmen to refresh the wallpaper or repair the parquet floors. The surrounding grounds were transformed into well-tended gardens with rare plants and smooth paths. Servants cleaned every inch of the space daily, removing even the slightest traces of dust. The house was perceived as a fortress, protecting against the dirty outside world. Slum dwellers had no means to repair their dilapidated homes. Landlords were interested only in receiving rent on time. Leaky roofs and broken staircases remained the tenants' own problem. People had to patch holes in the walls with old newspapers and pieces of cardboard. There was no question of any improvements to the courtyards under such harsh conditions. The difference in housing quality directly reflected the social divide between the classes. A mansion provided a sense of security, privacy, and confidence in the future. An overcrowded room in the slums deprived a person of any personal space. The entire life of a poor person unfolded in full view of dozens of strangers. This constant proximity took a heavy toll on one's mental health, but the workers simply had no choice. These two worlds coexisted side by side, separated by just a few miles of paved streets. Are you ready to learn the truth about how daily life and personal hygiene were managed in these vastly different conditions? In the next chapter, you'll discover why some could enjoy porcelain bathtubs while others had never seen clean water. The secret that people pay thousands for is often hidden in the simplest things. The attitude toward cleanliness in the 19th century was quite unique and often contradictory. High society turned personal hygiene into a complex and expensive ritual. At the same time, a vast portion of the capital's population was completely cut off from basic sanitation. Access to clean water became the main indicator of belonging to the privileged class. The first specialized washrooms began to appear in the mansions of the elite. Huge porcelain and copper bathtubs were filled with hot water by dozens of servants. The bathing process took several hours and involved the use of expensive oils and soaps. Homeowners could change their snow-white linen several times a day at the slightest whim. This ideal cleanliness was intended to emphasize the distance from the city's dirty streets. For residents of the eastern neighborhoods, water remained an incredible luxury. In the slums, there was no centralized water supply or enclosed sewer systems. A single street pump often served several thousand people, operating for only a couple of hours a day. People lined up in huge queues with buckets to get murky liquid of dubious quality. They had to conserve this water, using the same portion for washing and laundry. The aristocracy actively used the services of professional laundries outside the city. The finest fabrics were sent to special establishments where they were carefully bleached and starched. Snow-white collars and cuffs served as the hallmark of a successful gentleman. The presence of even a single stain on a suit was considered a public disgrace in high society. Caring for one's wardrobe required enormous financial costs and constant attention. Working people wore dark-colored clothing to hide the inevitable traces of soot and machine oil. Clothes had to be washed in basins of cold water using harsh lye. This process damaged the fabric and required enormous physical effort after a hard day's work. Clothes were dried right in cramped rooms, filling the space with dampness and heavy odors. Many poor people had only one set of clothes, which they wore for months without washing. The development of perfumery was the elite's response to the smells of the big city. Wealthy ladies and gentlemen used perfume liberally to create a fragrant barrier around themselves. While out walking, they would hold scented handkerchiefs to their faces as they passed through rough neighborhoods. Artificial scents of lavender and roses replaced the natural smells of everyday life. This created the illusion of being in a blooming garden in the middle of an industrial metropolis. The problem of waste disposal was handled extremely unevenly across the city. In the wealthy neighborhoods, trash was hauled away regularly using special covered carts. The courtyards of the mansions were kept in perfect order, and the sidewalks in front of them were swept daily. In working-class neighborhoods, piles of trash could lie right in the narrow streets for weeks. No one cared about the upkeep of places where members of high society did not appear. The use of soap in working-class families was extremely limited due to high taxes on the product. A simple bar of soap cost more than a full meal, so it was treasured like a precious item. People washed themselves with plain water, trying to scrub away factory soot with rough rags. True bodily cleanliness was physically unattainable for those who spent 14 hours at their workbenches. External untidiness became an indelible stigma that was impossible to shake off. Interestingly, the very concepts of hygiene varied greatly depending on social class. For the elite, cleanliness meant a radiant appearance, a pleasant scent, and the complete absence of visible flaws. For the poor, something was considered clean if it lacked obvious layers of dirt and allowed one to continue working. These two completely different standards never intersected in real life. The urban environment strictly dictated the conditions of existence for each of its inhabitants. As a result, running water and sewage systems became a powerful tool of social division. Cleanliness was bought for a fortune, becoming an exclusive commodity for the select few. If you enjoyed this unusual look at 19th century life, be sure to like this video. What if everything you were taught about classic English dining is outdated? The culinary world of Victorian London was just as polarized as its architecture. The tables of the aristocracy were laden with exquisite dishes brought from all corners of the vast empire. At the same time, the diet of ordinary workers consisted of the cheapest and often poorest quality foods. Food served not merely as a source of energy, but as the most important indicator of a family's social status. Dinner parties in wealthy homes were grand theatrical productions. A meal could consist of 10 or 12 courses, served in strict order. Rare tropical fruits, expensive wines, and elaborate pastries appeared on the tables. Specially trained chefs prepared turtle soup and roasted pheasants in their own feathers. The process of consuming the meal took several hours and was accompanied by social conversation. Tea drinking culture also varied greatly across different social classes. The elite turned afternoon tea into a refined ritual using the finest porcelain. They brewed rare varieties imported from India and China, serving them with fresh pastries. Workers drank cheap tea substitutes from rough tin mugs simply to keep warm. This hot beverage often served as a substitute for a full dinner during the cold winter months. Attitudes toward sweets highlighted the enormous financial gap between the classes. Pastry shops for the wealthy sold intricate sculptures made of sugar and exotic chocolate. These desserts cost a fortune and served as decorations for festive tables. Slum dwellers rarely even saw ordinary granulated sugar on their tables. Sweets were considered an unaffordable luxury for those who could barely make ends meet. The process of food storage required significant space and special equipment. In the spacious basements of wealthy mansions, there were cool rooms for meat, wine cellars, and pantries. Large supplies of ice allowed delicacies to be kept fresh, especially during the hot summer months. The poor bought food in tiny portions for a single meal, as they had nowhere to store it. In the summer, spoiled food became a fact of life in the cramped and stuffy neighborhoods. The kitchen equipment in the mansions resembled the complex industrial machinery of the time. There were huge cast-iron stoves, water heating systems, and copper cookware of impeccable cleanliness. Entire teams of assistants, cooks, and dishwashers worked in these kitchens. The servants' quarters lacked even basic stoves or fireplaces for cooking. Food was reheated on open braziers right in the courtyards or in the communal kitchens of tenement houses. High society table etiquette demanded knowledge of hundreds of unspoken rules. The proper use of dozens of forks and knives was considered an essential skill for any gentleman. A mistake in choosing a wine glass could cost one's reputation in high society. Ordinary people ate with their hands or wooden spoons directly from communal pots or cheap bowls. For them, the mere fact of having food mattered, not the way it was served. Differences in diets shaped completely different physical types of people within the same city. High-quality food gave the elite energy, a healthy complexion, and longevity. Could you survive on nothing but bread and water for many months? In the next chapter, you'll learn why free time became the primary indicator of wealth. In the 19th century, the very concept of time was perceived quite differently across social classes. For the aristocracy, time was an endless resource for rest, entertainment, and self-improvement. Their lives were governed not by the factory whistle, but by the calendar of social seasons, balls, and theatrical premieres. Spending time in idleness was considered the ultimate sign of belonging to the privileged class. Working for money was considered a shameful occupation for a true gentleman. The life of an ordinary worker was completely subject to a grueling production schedule. A shift at the factory could last from 14 to 16 hours without the right to a proper rest. Time did not belong to the worker, but to the factory owner, who bought it for a pittance. Days off were practically non-existent, except for rare religious holidays. The poor man's entire life boiled down to a monotonous route from the machine to a hard bed in the slums. Physical labor was considered the lot of the lower classes and was despised in high society. Engineers, builders, and weavers devoted all their energy to creating the material wealth of the great empire. Meanwhile, the owners of these factories spent their days in clubs, discussing politics and art. Calloused hands were the main sign of a person at the bottom of the social ladder. The smooth white skin of the aristocrats underscored their complete lack of physical exertion. Travel served as yet another marker of the colossal social divide. Wealthy families traveled to resorts in continental Europe, to Italy or Switzerland. They could afford long trips to improve their health or study ancient architecture. An ordinary worker might never leave his neighborhood in his entire life. The poor man's world was limited to a few familiar streets, thick with factory smoke. Education was also viewed not as a necessity, but as a privilege for the select few. Young aristocrats studied at prestigious universities, learning Latin, philosophy, and literature. They were prepared to govern the country, manage estates, and carry on family traditions. Adult factory workers rarely knew how to read and write fluently, as they had not attended school. Their main skill became the ability to operate complex machines and mechanisms in factories. Even the rhythm of walking on the city streets revealed a person's social background. Gentlemen strolled slowly and deliberately, leaning on expensive canes and enjoying the scenery. They were in no hurry, as their time was not measured by piecework wages. Workers always moved with a quick, weary stride, afraid of being late for the factory and receiving a fine. Their movements were abrupt and mechanical, reflecting constant inner tension. The entertainment industry strictly segregated the public by the size of their wallets. Tickets to the opera or trendy theater productions were incredibly expensive. The auditoriums were filled with ladies in velvet dresses and men in tailcoats, sparkling with jewels. For the poor, there were street performances, cheap vaudeville shows, and free parks on the outskirts. These two cultural worlds never intersected, each preserving its own unique traditions and forms. For the poor, unemployment meant immediate disaster and the loss of one's home. Being laid off from a factory led to a spiral of debt and utter social ruin. For the wealthy, idleness was a natural state and a source of pride. These opposing views on labor formed the foundation of Victorian social inequality. Society severely punished those who attempted to change the way of life prescribed for them. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the weather became a harsh ordeal? The onset of winter in Victorian London was the hardest time of year for millions of people. The cold did not merely cause discomfort, it physically divided the city into two distinct realities. In wealthy mansions, winter was associated with cozy evenings by a roaring fireplace and festive balls. In working-class neighborhoods, the drop in temperature meant the start of a daily, grueling struggle to stay warm. Heating large mansions required enormous quantities of high-quality coal. Servants constantly carried fuel from the cellars, keeping the fires burning in every room of the vast house. Thick velvet curtains protected the rooms from drafts, keeping the heat inside the halls. The owners could afford to walk around the house in light clothing, feeling no chill at all. For them, winter was merely a beautiful backdrop behind the thick glass of tall windows. In the slums, buying even a small sack of coal became a serious financial problem. People gathered old planks, branches, and any combustible trash from the streets for their tiny stoves. The temperature in the overcrowded rooms often dropped to near freezing levels. Families had to sleep huddled together without taking off their outerwear and coats. The walls were covered with frost on the inside, and the water in the jugs froze over the course of a single long night. The extra calories helped them easily endure their rare trips out into the freezing streets. In winter, the poor often lost even their meager earnings due to reduced daylight hours in the factories. Their bread rations became even smaller just when their bodies needed the most energy. Frozen water in street hydrants became a real disaster for the residents of East London. People were forced to melt dirty street snow to get even a little liquid. At the same time, the water supply system in elite homes operated without interruption thanks to the constant heating of the pipes. Hot water was always available to the homeowners on demand at any time of day. This basic resource became an unattainable luxury for most city dwellers in the winter. Lighting during the winter months became yet another sign of wealth. Gas lamps and bright candles generously illuminated the living rooms of mansions, creating an atmosphere of perpetual celebration. In the homes of the poor, there were often not even cheap tallow candles, and people sat in complete darkness. After sunset, life in the slums came to a standstill, as without light it was impossible to work or read. The darkness intensified the feeling of hopelessness and isolation from the rest of the city, which was aglow with lights. The cold turned the city into a harsh test of endurance. Some enjoyed the winter scenery, while others counted the days until spring arrived. Do you think it was possible to get used to such constant cold inside one's own home? In the next chapter, you will learn why wealth and poverty were passed down through generations like family traits. Social mobility in Victorian England was more of a theoretical concept than a reality. Wealth and poverty were not the result of chance or mere luck. They constituted a rigidly structured system that reproduced itself from generation to generation. Being born into a particular family automatically determined a person's entire future life path, down to the last detail. Moving from one social class to another was as difficult as changing the color of one's own eyes. Aristocratic estates had been formed over centuries and were securely protected by complex inheritance laws. Lands, castles, and capital were passed down to the eldest son, keeping the family's power intact. This system ensured that vast resources would always remain concentrated in the hands of a select few. Each new generation of the elite began its journey with a massive advantage in the form of ready capital and connections. They did not need to fight for stability. Their task was simply to multiply what they had received. In working-class neighborhoods, only debts and heavy obligations were passed down. A factory worker's family had no property to leave to their descendants. They had no savings in banks, no land, and no expensive family heirlooms. The poor man's only capital was his physical strength and his ability to perform monotonous labor. This meager resource was quickly depleted by old age, leaving nothing for future generations. The education system served as the primary mechanism for reinforcing this class inequality. Exclusive universities educated future lords, ministers, and owners of large corporations. There, useful connections were formed that determined graduates' careers for decades to come. Adult factory workers had no access to any continuing education courses or night schools. The lack of basic knowledge permanently closed off their path to more promising and higher-paying professions. The tools of the financial system worked exclusively for those who already had money. Banks readily granted loans to wealthy gentlemen for investments in new factories or railroads. Taxes and duties were distributed in such a way that the main burden fell on consumers of goods, not on their producers. The interests of ordinary workers were virtually unrepresented in the governing bodies of the great empire. The rules of the game were always set by those who were originally at the top of the social pyramid. Even if a poor person managed to save a small amount, inflation and crises quickly wiped out those savings. The lack of reliable tools for preserving capital rendered any attempts to escape poverty futile. At the same time, the elite's fortunes were diversified across real estate, stocks, and government bonds. Financial storms rarely dealt a crushing blow to the old aristocratic families. Stability was a privilege accessible only to those possessing colossal resources. The vicious cycle of poverty was a mathematically precise mechanism that operated without fail. It drained a person of all their strength, offering no prospects for improvement in return. Wealth, on the other hand, functioned as a powerful magnet, drawing new resources and opportunities toward itself. These two parallel systems of status reproduction never faltered throughout the entire century. Society had frozen in its ideal and at the same time, unyielding form. The very geography of London's streets served as a visual guide to social inequality. The city did not develop chaotically, but rather obeyed the strict laws of the concentration of capital and political influence. The western districts, known as the West End, were shaped as a showcase of imperial power and prosperity. Wide avenues, majestic squares, and green parks were created specifically for the aristocracy's leisurely strolls. The East End, the eastern part of the capital, became a vast industrial zone, hidden from public view. Winds in London predominantly blow from west to east, and this played a decisive role. All the acrid smoke from thousands of factory chimneys was carried unhindered toward the working-class neighborhoods. The elite's western residences always remained a zone of clean air and clear skies. This climatic feature became the main reason for such a strict division of the city's territories. Nature itself seemed to help the wealthy shield themselves from the unpleasant consequences of the Industrial Revolution. The boundary between these two worlds often ran along a single specific street or boulevard. Crossing this invisible line, a person instantly found themselves transported from a glittering district to a gloomy industrial area. The police carefully patrolled these border zones, preventing suspicious individuals from entering the affluent neighborhoods. The appearance of the buildings changed dramatically. Stucco moldings disappeared, and bare brickwork appeared. Even the soundscape shifted from the quiet rustle of carriages to the deafening roar of machinery. In affluent neighborhoods, great attention was paid to creating artificial landscapes and green spaces. Hyde Park and other royal gardens provided the elite with vast areas for horseback riding and picnics. Behind high cast-iron railings, gardeners carefully cultivated flowers and trimmed perfect lawns. Trees shielded the mansions from city noise, creating the illusion of a country estate right in the heart of the capital. Access to such parks was often restricted by a strict dress code and an entrance fee. Industrial areas were completely devoid of any vegetation, except for the occasional weed. Every available square meter of land was built up with apartment buildings or new factory workshops. For years, workers did not see green grass or spring leaves blooming on the trees. The gray of brick and the black of coal became the only color palette for millions of people. This total absence of nature weighed heavily on the psyche and turned the city into a stone cage. Railroads also cut the city into isolated segments, exacerbating social isolation. To lay tracks in the city center, poor neighborhoods were demolished en masse, leaving people homeless. Train stations were built as grandiose temples of the new industrial era, striking in their immense scale. Overpasses and embankments created artificial mountains that permanently cut off one district from another. Getting around the city became an increasingly difficult process for those without a carriage. Even street names reflected the status of their residents and the historical ownership of the land. In the West End, grand names of dukes, royal titles, and names of great victories prevailed. In the East End, streets were named after the craft workshops or trade routes located there. A person's address instantly revealed everything about their status to creditors, employers, and the police. It was simply impossible to hide one's origins while living in a particular postal district. This architectural and geographical segregation proved so successful that its traces are still visible today. 19th century London became the ideal model of a city where architecture serves the interests of capital. Stone and brick proved to be more reliable guardians of privilege than any army. These invisible walls stood for decades, dividing the fates of millions of city dwellers into two parallel streams. The East End and the West End became symbols of the greatest social divide in history. Justifying such a glaring social divide required the creation of a special social philosophy. The elite could not simply ignore the existence of millions of people living below the poverty line. Therefore, a convenient theory was formulated, according to which poverty was declared the result of personal failure. Wealthy citizens sincerely believed that their wealth was a reward for the virtue and hard work of their ancestors. Poverty, on the other hand, was perceived as punishment for laziness, lack of discipline, and bad character traits. This philosophy was actively supported by the press and popular literature of the time. Magazines constantly published articles on the importance of cultivating willpower and thrift. They cited rare examples of how hard work helped people escape the slums. These isolated success stories were used to accuse the rest of the workers of not working hard enough. The true causes of poverty, such as low wages and a lack of opportunities to get started, were completely ignored. The state welfare system was built precisely on this strict approach. Workhouses were created not to help people, but to make their lives as difficult as possible. Conditions inside these institutions were deliberately made worse than even the most grueling factory work. A person would have preferred any factory job to ending up within the walls of such an institution. This was a way to force people to accept any employment conditions, even the most unfavorable ones. Charity among the upper classes often took on a condescending and patronizing tone. Wealthy ladies visited poor neighborhoods to hand out moral lectures along with cheap food. They demanded from the workers perfect obedience, sobriety, and endless gratitude for the crumbs from the master's table. No one attempted to change the very system that generated such a monstrous shortage of resources. Aid was always accompanied by lectures on the proper way of life and the importance of humility. Crime in working-class neighborhoods was viewed not as a consequence of desperation, but as an inherent trait of the lower classes. Politicians and the courts treated slum dwellers, with inherent suspicion and extreme severity. For the slightest misdemeanor or the theft of a loaf of bread, a person could face severe punishment or hard labor. At the same time, the financial schemes of the gentry often went unpunished thanks to lawyers and connections. The law had two completely different faces depending on the social status of the accused. Factory owners viewed their employees solely as interchangeable cogs in a machine. They felt no responsibility for the fate of those who lost their health in their factories. An industrial injury meant immediate dismissal without any compensation or severance pay. A person who lost the ability to work became a burden on society and was cut off from active life. Capital demanded maximum efficiency, leaving no room for compassion toward ordinary workers. High society created a romanticized image of the noble pauper who patiently endures the blows of fate. This image had nothing to do with the harsh reality of the dirty and grueling streets. Aristocrats preferred to see workers as humble laborers who joyfully tipped their hats to a passing carriage. Any demands for higher wages or protests were perceived as dangerous rebellion and ingratitude. The system defended its peace with every available police and ideological means. The concept of success in Victorian society was strictly tied to financial status and background. A talented inventor from the lower classes often could not bring his ideas to fruition without a patron from high society. Patents and capital went to those who already held secure positions in society. The intellectual potential of millions of people remained untapped due to a lack of access to a good education. A vast number of talents were lost in the slums, never having had a chance to change their lives. Social snobbery permeated all strata of society, causing people to look down on those lower on the social ladder. Even among the workers themselves, there was a rigid hierarchy based on skill and income. A highly skilled mechanic would never sit at the same table with a simple laborer or a porter. This internal division prevented people from uniting to defend their common interests. The elite skillfully exploited these divisions, maintaining their absolute power over the city. The philosophy of the poor man's guilt became the perfect shield for Victorian capitalism. It absolved society of any responsibility for the fates of millions of destitute people. Wealth was declared synonymous with virtue, while poverty became a mark of social failure. This convenient theory allowed gentlemen to rest peacefully in their warm mansions without a thought for the freezing workers. The illusion of justice was maintained as long as the system generated colossal profits for the empire. Victorian London went down in history as a city of the most incredible and stark contrasts. It was the capital of an empire on which the sun never set, the center of world trade and industry, and at the same time, it was a vast factory for turning human labor into shiny coins. The grandeur of palaces and the horror of slums existed not merely at the same time, but on neighboring streets. This duality became the defining symbol of the entire historical era of the 19th century. Invisible walls built of prejudice, money, and laws proved stronger than fortress ramparts. They divided society into two isolated camps that spoke different languages and lived by different rules. Members of the elite enjoyed the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, traveling and collecting art. For workers, the limits of their dreams were confined to a hot dinner and a dry roof over their heads. There were no points of intersection between them, except for factory workshops and the kitchens of mansions. Hygiene, food, and housing became not merely matters of comfort, but instruments of strict segregation. A porcelain bathtub, a lump of white sugar, and clean air turned into exclusive commodities for the select few. The city's entire economy was geared towards satisfying the luxurious demands of a tiny segment of the population. Millions of people served this system, receiving in return only the most basic resources for survival. The capital's architecture forever set this inequality in stone and brick. The cold winters each year reminded residents of the true value of their lives. The warmth of the fireplaces in the West End was paid for with the health of those who mined coal and froze in the East End. The city's smog served as a constant reminder of who exactly was turning the wheel of the great economy. Inheritance laws ensured that this state of affairs would remain unchanged for decades. Capital reliably protected itself from any encroachments by ordinary citizens. The psychological chasm between the classes turned out to be even deeper than the financial divide. The rich's confidence in their own exceptionalism gave rise to a system of total indifference to the hardships of others. The poor were made to feel guilty for their situation, which paralyzed any will to resist. Society had turned into a complex mechanism where the cogs had no right to question the engineer's design. Any attempts to change this system were harshly suppressed by the police and strict laws. The era left behind a vast number of beautiful novels, picturesque paintings, and scientific discoveries. However, the foundation for this cultural flourishing was the grueling labor of disenfranchised people. Exquisite tea sets were produced in factories with harsh working conditions and toxic materials. Expensive silk dresses were sewn in dimly lit rooms by women who were losing their eyesight by candlelight. The art of the elite was always paid for by the hidden efforts of those who remained behind the scenes of history. Over time, this immense strain began to lead to inevitable social upheavals and reforms. Labor unions and political movements began a long struggle for the basic rights of the working masses. However, during the classic Victorian period, the power of capital remained absolute and unchallenged. The city continued to function as a perfect machine for the enrichment of a narrow circle of individuals. Two parallel realities continued their course, trying not to notice each other on the cobblestone streets. Studying this period helps us better understand the nature of social inequality throughout human history. The Victorian experience shows how easily society can divide people into the successful and the invisible. It demonstrates that technological progress alone does not bring prosperity to all segments of the population. Without social reforms, any machines and factories only serve to widen the gap between classes. This is a harsh lesson about the importance of preserving human dignity in an era of great industrial change. The story of these two worlds within a single reality remains relevant today. It makes us reflect on the invisible boundaries that exist in modern cities and metropolises. The treatment of those at the bottom of society is always the primary indicator of a civilization's development. The Victorian era left us not only beautiful architecture, but also many unresolved moral questions. This experience serves as an important warning to all future generations of builders of great systems. Ultimately, the glamour of balls and the clatter of machine tools became two equally significant voices of a single era. It is impossible to understand the 19th century by studying only palaces or only factory outskirts. The truth always lies at the intersection of these two completely different and incomparable realities. London at that time became a giant mirror reflecting all the achievements of human genius. It was an amazing, harsh, and infinitely complex era that forever changed the face of the entire world. We looked behind the beautiful facade of history and saw the harsh truth about two worlds within a single reality. The experiences of the people of that time are a lesson in how injustice can become the accepted norm. Let us know in the comments what topics you'd like to see in future videos on our channel. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on new, exciting historical investigations.